What's up, everybody? Back here with another set review, this time of the Theros Block. Now, Theros Block is a very fun block, one of my favorites from back in the day. We have a lot of really powerful cards. This was one of the first times they started reprinting some historically powerful cards back into Standard, as well as the power levels trying to meet those powerful effects. So we have a lot of very powerful cards in this block. Now, before we get into those, be sure to hit that subscribe button down below. It really helps me out, as well as throwing a little like and potentially a comment if you have any cards that you think I missed from this block, as well as letting me know some of your favorite cards from the Theros block. All right, with that, let's hop into Theros. So, unfortunately, even though there are a lot of powerful effects in Theros, many of these cards have been supplanted by modern sets. Best example I have is Destructive Revelry. Used to be a staple in Modern. Standard was replaced by Cinder Vines from the latest Ravnica set, and unfortunately I feel like had we done this a couple years ago, Theros would have even more cards playable, but as it is, there's still a fair amount to look at. So, starting with Theros, we have Thoughtseize. Huge pillar of the format, obviously goes in almost every deck that can play it in Pioneer, and this was that first instance of them reprinting a very powerful effect into Standard. Obviously this card saw tons of play in Standard with Mono Black Devotion, and since then it's been played in every format you can play it in. Not much to say for such a ubiquitous format staple, but Theros saw the first printing of it in several years since Little Room Block, and it's greatly shaped the Pioneer landscape. Next up, we have Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, one of my favorite cards of all time. This card abuses the devotion mechanic by allowing you to ramp incredibly quickly, surpassing most forms of ramp. When it's doing its thing, it often looks like a Gaia's Cradle in disguise, where you suddenly just jump so far ahead of the opponent that they're not really playing the same game as you. Again, this has been a staple in every format since it's been printed, less so over time in Modern, but in Pioneer, a lot of the monocolored decks will still use this. Mono Green Devotion specifically gets a lot of value out of this card, especially with cards like Vivian Arcbow Ranger. Next up, we have Anger of the Gods, another one of those cards that power level wise saw play right across the board as soon as it was printed. This is one of the best wrath effects in Pioneer as well as in older formats like Modern. 3 damage is a really good sweet spot for a lot of the aggressive decks, and being able to exile problematic permanents is a big reason that some of the decks like Mono Black Aggro are able to be dealt with in Pioneer. Next up, we have Sylvan Caryatid, another throwback to one of my favorite cards of all time. The best mana ramp in the 5-color decks in Pioneer. Every deck that can run Sylvan Caryatid and wants to be playing 4 or 5 colors usually will. Definitively, in my mind, the best 2-mana ramp spell in the format. I think it is here to stay for a very long time in Pioneer. Next up, we have Hero's Downfall, which was just reprinted at Uncommon in Innistrad Crimson Vow. The original printing of Hero's Downfall saw a ton of play in Standard across the board. However, in Pioneer, it's mostly a blue-black control card that will occasionally see play, but the printing of Murderous Rider somewhat knocked it down a peg in most decks. Next up, we have the Scrylands. Much like with Ravnica, looking at the Shocklands, the Scrylands are split up among the 3 different sets. So in Theros, we have Temple of Deceit, Temple of Abandon, Temple of Mystery, Temple of Triumph, and Temple of Silence. While these see different levels of play across the format, the most ubiquitous being Temple of Mystery and Lotus Field, usually you'll see some number of these floating around. They have slowly been weaned out, but a lot of decks that really want the effect will usually play a lot of them. Like I said, Lotus Field is high up on the list. Unfortunately, again, a lot of these lands have mostly been supplanted moving forward. Next up, we have Chained to the Rocks, perennial all-star in the Jeskai Ascendancy deck, as well as Burn as a sideboard option, able to deal with big threats like Niv or Omnath out of decks that usually can't interact with large creatures 1-for-1. Next up, we have a couple of uncommons and commons that sort of all pair together. 3 of these cards mostly only exist in the same deck. The Red-White Feather deck that has now switched to just being a Red-White Luris deck, and that is Favored Hoplite, Titan Strength, and God's Willing. These have been staples in Feather-style heroic decks since they were printed. When Pioneer was first around, the Feather deck was something people took into consideration from its power level in Standard. It's faded a bit, and like I said, it's cut Feather completely and moved more towards a Luris package, but it does still see play in Pioneer and is still an explosive aggro deck. So these 3 cards really go together. They rarely see play outside of each other, but again, in that one deck, they're all staples. And lastly from Theros, we have the first printing of Lightning Strike. This was a big card when it was printed in Standard, one of the first cards that re-enabled a lot of the red aggressive burn decks to come back. Lightning Strike is a ubiquitous burn spell in the mono red aggro deck that just top 8'd the Pioneer Showcase this last weekend, as well as in most red burn decks. It's just really an efficient spell, and there's really not much better on rate in Pioneer right now. Next up, we move on to Born of the Gods. We start off with another red burn spell. You might start to see a pattern that the Theros block introduced a lot of very powerful red and black cards. This we start with Searing Blood, obviously a great sideboard staple out of burn and mono red. Being able to interact with cheap creatures and still deal damage to the face is a huge component of why burn is so powerful against decks that want to try and fight on the ground. Next up, we have Springleaf Drum, a staple of the old affinity decks in Modern, but in Pioneer, the Ensoul decks like to use Springleaf Drum to accelerate ahead, as well as pump up the All That Glitters package that helps them push through damage. For Scrylands, in Born of the Gods, we have Temple of Enlightenment, Temple of Plenty, and Temple of Malice. Once again, Temple of Enlightenment will see some play here or there, but of these three, most of them have been pushed out. Some decks will use them. I'm sure they will cycle back around as they still see Modern play in some combo decks, so I never like to rule them out. Next up, we have Satyr Fire Dancer, another one of the sideboard burn cards. Being able to, once again, deal damage to the face and interact with the board is a great way to deal with creature-based decks in Pioneer. Last up from Born of the Gods, we have Satyr Wayfinder, the mulch on a stick that has been used ever since its printing. It helps fuel the graveyard, helps get you lands to hand, and often is used in decks like Soul Flayer, Sultai, Midrange, and other decks that want to fuel the graveyard, as well as make sure they hit their land drops on time. Next up, we move to Journey to Nyx, another one of the sets that doesn't have a lot of staples, but the staples are very powerful. So we start with Eidolon of the Great Revel, a absolute staple in every format for every aggressive red deck. Whether you're playing mono red aggro or burn, you are on 4 Eidolon. It is one of the most effective cards against a lot of the strategies in Pioneer. Absolutely an all-star of the format. Next up, we have Mana Confluence, which again, due to the lack of fetch lands in the format, does tend to show up in 5-color decks, as well as 2-color decks that don't have fast lands. Think Green-White Company. Mana Confluence is a great way to fix colors, even though the pain does actually matter with the aggressive decks that are in the format. Next up, we have Eidolon of Rhetoric, a card that sees fringe play, especially when decks like Lotus Field or Jeskai Ascendancy are on the rise. Right now, the card's on a downswing due to the popularity of Rending Volley, a card that previously didn't see a lot of play, so you're able to get out of range of things that would kill Archon of Maria. Now, Rending Volley keeps Eidolon in check. Next up, we have Magma Spray, which unfortunately will probably be coming off this list shortly due to the new version that was printed in Crimson Vow that can go to a creature or a planeswalker with the same effect, 2 damage, exile if it was killed this turn. So unfortunately, this will probably be the last day of Magma Spray's popularity in the format. Finally, we round out with the Scrylands, Temple of Malady and Temple of Epiphany. Again, these will see play periodically on and off. This isn't like the Shocklands where they are a lock to fill the format. Now let's look at the top 3 cards not currently seeing play in Pioneer that I think have the chance to do something interesting. Number 1, gonna start off with Ashiok Nightmare Weaver. This card is a horrible card to have to deal with as a control player. If you can't get it off the board and it goes up so quickly in loyalty, it will take over a game. It can absolutely defend itself well, and if it goes for 1 or 2 turns unchecked, you often will be able to get a powerful creature on your side. This card was a dominating threat to control decks in its standard, and I'm kind of surprised it hasn't found a home. I think the problem really lies with the decks currently that are very good in Pioneer, and I imagine if we start to see Phoenix fall off, Ashiok might be a tool used to try and fight some of these control decks. Next up, we have Keranos, God of Storms, one of my favorite modern cards back when it was in Twin, as well as Blue Moon. Unfortunately, a 5-mana engine is a little bit tough to justify when people can just be killing you if you tap out. However, I think as the format develops and continues to grow, I think cards like Keranos that are hard to deal with, difficult to fight through in a long game, will start to see more play as the games extend and as we see potentially some of the Delve cards removed from the format. Next up, we have Ashen Rider, another powerful Reanimator card that I think is only kept down by the fact that we don't have cards the power level of Persist and things like that. If we see Reanimator pushed in any sets in the upcoming years, I fully expect a card like Ashen Rider to be present and part of those decks. So let's jump to our our superlatives. First up, the set with the most banned cards. None of the Theros sets have had any cards banned in Pioneer, so we'll be back there, but we have to retroactively give the set with the most banned cards to Gatecrash because I actually missed that it did have one card banned, and that is Undercity Informer. So Gatecrash will remain the set with the most banned cards. The set with the most played cards is going to stay Return to Ravnica. I can't justify it pushing all 5 Scrylands into Theros since realistically only Mystery sees enough play to count. So if you only count Mystery, it doesn't surpass RTR. Set with the least played cards, for the same reason Journey to Nyx is going to take over from Dragon's Maze, because again, the Scrylands do not see enough play for me to count them realistically, and I think it would be unfair to Dragon's Maze to put it at the very bottom when a set like Journey to Nyx really only added 2 cards that are constant staples, 2 sideboard cards that are sometimes staples, one of which will be falling off very shortly, and the 2 Scrylands that even if you assume one of them counts, I think we can't count Magma Spray moving forward. So I'm going to say that Journey to Nyx is going to be our set with the least played cards so far. Thanks everybody for watching. Let me know in the comments down below what you think about Theros Block, and I hope you've enjoyed this set review. Thanks so much. Until next time.